The summer of 1976 began like a dream. After several years of grey and unstable weather, Britons greeted the June warmth with delight. People flocked to buy sunscreen, pulled out deck chairs, and rejoiced at the opportunity to spend weekends in parks. But very soon, that joy turned into confusion, and then into real fear. The air temperature, which rarely crosses the plus 25 degrees Celsius mark in Britain, suddenly soared to plus 30 degrees Celsius and stayed there for long weeks. June 23, 1976, marked the beginning of a period that would later be called the Great Heat. For 15 consecutive days, temperatures in London and the south of the country did not drop below plus 32 degrees Celsius, peaking at an incredible plus 35.9 degrees Celsius. For a country whose architecture and lifestyle had been honed for centuries to retain heat, this was the start of a disaster. British houses, famous for their brick walls and lack of air conditioning, turned into glowing ovens. The asphalt on London's roads began to melt and stick to the soles of pedestrians, while the iconic red buses became mobile torture chambers. Railway tracks began to buckle under the influence of extreme heat, causing mass cancellations and fears of derailments. But the most terrifying thing was the change in the landscape. Britain's emerald green fields, celebrated by poets, were turning into lifeless yellow straw before everyone's eyes. The ground began to crack, revealing deep fissures wide enough to fit a hand into. The sun, which had always been considered a rare guest and a blessing, turned into a merciless enemy, methodically destroying everything in its path. By early July, it was clear that this was not just good weather, but a climatic anomaly for which modern 70s Britain was completely unprepared. The country had no mass cooling systems, and water reserves in reservoirs began to dwindle rapidly. People woke up in sticky, stifling heat, realizing that the sky remained cloudless and a poisonous shade of blue. Newspapers that just a week ago were recommending the best beaches changed their tone to panic. How to survive in a scorching city. This was the beginning of a long, grueling ordeal, where every new ray of sunshine was perceived not as a gift, but as another hammer blow to the cracked earth of the island. By mid-July 1976, the water situation in the UK had become critical. Reservoirs that were usually brimming to the edge turned into cracked mud pits. But the most striking sight awaited those in the countryside. Ghost villages began to emerge from the receding waters. The ruins of houses, churches, and bridges submerged decades earlier to create artificial lakes saw sunlight once again. It looked like a mystical return of the past, a grim warning of a looming catastrophe. Rivers like the Thames and the Severn became so shallow that in some places they could be forded without getting one's knees wet. Fish died en masse in the overheated, stagnant pools, creating an unbearable stench along banks that were once favorite spots for walks. James Callaghan's government realized the magnitude of the crisis only when rolling water shutoffs began in major industrial cities. In August, an unprecedented post was created, Minister for Drought, filled by Dennis Howell. His task was to convince the nation to save every drop. A nationwide ban on garden hoses was implemented. Anyone caught watering their scorched lawn or washing their car faced a hefty fine. Famous propaganda posters appeared with the slogan, "Save water, bath with a friend." It became a national joke, but the situation was anything but funny. In Wales and southwest England, water was rationed, and standpipes were installed in the streets, with queues of people carrying buckets and jerry cans as if it were wartime. Industry faced the threat of a complete shutdown. Steel mills and power plants consumed colossal amounts of water that simply wasn't there. Authorities began to seriously discuss plans to tow icebergs from the Arctic to the British coast for desalination. Every day, newspapers printed rainfall maps showing zeros across the entire country. People began making pilgrimages to dried-up holy wells, and churches officially offered prayers for rain. Britain, accustomed to fighting an excess of moisture, found itself a prisoner of thirst. The country was literally cracking at the seams under the scorching sky, waiting for even a single cloud to bring salvation. But the sky remained relentlessly clear. In late July 1976, a heat-exhausted Britain faced a phenomenon that many took for a sign of the apocalypse. Due to an abnormally warm spring followed by drought, the population of aphids, the primary food source for ladybirds, grew to incredible proportions. An explosive surge in the ladybird population followed. But when the heat scorched all vegetation and the aphids died off, billions of hungry insects took to the air in search of food. They moved in massive red clouds, visible even on meteorological radars. When these clouds descended on the cities, life came to a standstill. It was a surreal and eerie sight. The red, black-spotted beetles covered everything. The walls of houses, shop windows, parked cars, and people themselves. Along Britain's coasts, where crowds flocked in hopes of a breeze, ladybirds carpeted the beaches several centimeters deep. People had to walk on them as if on a living rug. But the most terrifying thing was their behavior. Deprived of their usual food, the hungry insects began to bite humans. The bites weren't fatal, but they were painful and triggered allergic reactions. Panicked people fled the streets, stuffing towels into window cracks, yet the tiny beetles got everywhere, into food, into clothing, and even into beds. Newspapers of the time ran headlines like "Invasion of the Red Killers" and "A Biblical Plague Over Britain." Biologists tried to reassure the public, explaining it as a natural cycle. But for the average Londoner or Bristolian whose skin was crawling with biting insects, it looked like the end of the world. The smell of crushed beetles, a specific acrid and bitter stench, permeated the city air. People began wearing protective masks and nets, while pest control services worked around the clock, unable to keep up with the billions of uninvited guests. It was the moment when nature finally broke its leash, proving that even the most harmless creature can become a nightmare if the climatic balance is shattered. By August 1976, the British landscape had completely lost its familiar features. The country resembled the scorched savannas of Africa or the deserts of Nevada. The absence of rain for months had turned the undergrowth and grass into perfect tinder. A single cigarette butt tossed from a car window or a shard of glass was enough to ignite a fire that was impossible to stop. Britain, where fire services had spent centuries learning to extinguish city buildings, found itself entirely unprepared for large-scale forest fires. Flames engulfed vast areas in Dorset, Hampshire, and Wales. The fire moved with the speed of the wind, devouring ancient oaks and pine forests, turning the sky over southern England into an ominous orange haze. The most terrifying ordeal was the peatland fires. Under the drought conditions, the peat had dried out to a depth of several meters, and the fire went underground. This was an invisible enemy. There were no flames on the surface, only thick, acrid smoke belching from cracks in the earth. An underground fire could stretch for miles, destroying tree roots that would then suddenly collapse onto roads and power lines. Fire crews worked at the limits of human endurance, literally suffocating in the smoke. But the ultimate irony was that they often had no water to fight the flames. Hydrants in the affected areas were dry. In some cases, the military had to blast strips of land to create fire breaks and stop the advance of the flames toward residential homes. Smoke from the forest fires mingled with urban smog, creating a stifling atmosphere. Hospitals saw hundreds of people daily with respiratory issues. In the countryside, farmers kept night watches, staring fearfully at the horizon, where the sky glowed crimson. Britain's wildlife suffered colossal losses. Millions of birds and small animals perished in the flames, unable to find refuge in the scorched wasteland. This summer had ceased to be just hot. It had become a time of national disaster, where people genuinely feared their island would simply burn to the ground if the heavens did not show mercy. The climax arrived suddenly, as if following an ironic script from a higher power. In late August, when Dennis Howell, the Minister for Drought, officially called on the nation to pray for rain, the heavens finally opened. On August 27, 1976, the first thunderstorms roared across Britain, but what should have been salvation turned into a new ordeal. The parched earth, as hard as concrete, simply could not absorb the water. Rainwater washed away the topsoil, turning city streets into raging rivers of mud. What Britons had awaited for months resulted in flash floods. Some areas saw more rainfall in 24 hours than in the entire preceding summer, and people who had been dying of thirst just yesterday were now desperately bailing water out of their basements. As the heat finally receded, Britain began to count the cost. The country's agriculture was devastated. Grain and vegetable crops had failed, leading to a sharp spike in food prices. Millions of trees had died, and forest recovery took decades. But the most significant outcome was a mental shift. The nation realized that climatic stability was an illusion. The summer of '76 prompted major changes in UK water management. New interconnecting pipelines and reservoirs were built so that a single dry year could never bring the country to its knees again. Half a century later, 1976 remains the gold standard of extreme weather for Britons. This summer has become a legend. Everyone who lived through it remembers the taste of warm water from a standpipe, the smell of burning peat, and the endless hum of millions of ladybirds. It was a time when a nation divided by the political and economic crises of the '70s suddenly united against a common, relentless enemy, the sun. The story of 1976 teaches us that nature can be far more unpredictable than any forecast, and that the familiar comfort of civilization depends on a delicate balance that can be shattered by a single, abnormally long anticyclonic loop.